The noon sun in Hollow Bend is a scorching sun that not only burns the skin, but also melts the patience of men. The dry earth cracks like an old hand, dust hangs in the air, waiting for a chance to settle in the open wound. The dry wind whips through the faded wooden porch, carrying the iron smell of new blood. In the middle of the street, where the wooden floor was worn and faded by many footsteps, Calla Granger stood barefoot in the hot dust. Her back was torn at the seams, bruises spreading purple and black. Each lash of Otis Granger's belt echoed loudly, followed by a silence heavier than the sound. She didn't cry. She just looked up past her father, her eyes resting on the man across the street. There was no pleading, no resentment, just a quiet look as if he had lived through many apocalypses. Otis was panting, his face red from alcohol and heat, his belly straining against his belt. Behind him, a nearly empty bottle of whiskey waited like a reward. No one moved. No one helped. The grocer swept a corner of the porch, leaving no speck of dust. A child peeked out from behind a crate, then disappeared as if it had never been there. Across the street, Levi Harrow held the reins tight, his calloused hands clutching something he dared not say. He was 24, his face lined with sun and loss. He had come to town only to sell his skins and see if he would have enough to eat this winter. But there were moments when a man's heart could not hide itself. It leapt out before reason could catch up. Otis raised his belt again. At that moment, Levi opened his mouth, his voice not loud but clear as a gunshot in an empty church. "Sell her to me." The whole street seemed frozen. The wind stopped between the bars of the porch. Otis slowly turned his head, his smile distorted with drunkenness. "What did you say?" Levi released the reins. His feet touched dry ground with the surety of someone who knew he was about to cross a line. "I said sell her to me. I need a wife. You need money. We can make a deal." Otis laughed a dry, hollow laugh. "Are you crazy, boy?" Levi bent down, unbuckled the money bag from the saddle, and dropped it to the ground. The sound of the coins falling into the dust was as heavy as a marker of fate. All he had left, a week's worth of food for the winter, maybe more. Calla's eyes glanced briefly at the purse, then back to Levi. In that moment, there was a tiny spark of something, not hope, not gratitude, but something close to challenge. Otis snorted, spitting on the ground. "It's not worth a dime, but it's yours now. Just don't bring it back here." He pushed Calla toward Levi. She staggered, her scratched hands in the dust. Levi took off his jacket and draped it over her shoulders, careful not to touch her skin. She flinched slightly but remained steady. "Let's go," he said, his voice almost commanding. Otis returned with the bottle, and the crowd quickly dispersed, burying the incident under the thick silence of Hollow Bend. Levi helped Calla onto the horse. His hand was as light as an unanswered question. They said nothing as they left the street. The road stretched before them, cracked and dusty, but each step was a step away from the invisible shackles that Otis had kept around her for so many years. The sun was slowly slanting west, casting a pale yellow light on Calla's back. She clutched the saddle horn, breathing shallowly, but her eyes were still fixed forward. Levi walked the horse, not looking at her, not out of shame, but because he felt that silence, the silence of someone who has found the smallest crack in the wall of confinement and knows that if he just steps through, he will never be the same again. They didn't know what the future would hold. But in that moment, amid the scorching sun and the dusty wind, Calla began to reclaim what was hers: freedom. If you find this story engaging and want to hear the whole journey of Levi and Calla, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The early afternoon wind from the southern prairie whipped dust into Levi's eyes, but he didn't blink. He held the reins, leading the horse away from Hollow Bend until the faded eaves were a blur behind him. Calla sat stiffly in the saddle, her hands gripping the saddle horns like a novice rider. Each hooves pounded the dry ground like a slow, drawn-out heartbeat. Levi's farm sat low at the foot of a bare hill, where the wind whistled through the wooden posts and a windmill creaked like an old man's breath. The fence was patchy in places, only rotten posts remained. There was a tiny goat pen, a barn that leaned westward as if about to fall, and the main house a simple, low-roofed block of wood, the paint so faded that it was unrecognizable. Levi led the horse into the yard and helped Calla down. She stepped onto the ground, wincing as her bare feet touched the gravel. He said nothing, just gestured toward the door. Inside the house was cleaner than the outside suggested. The smell of old wood mingled with the metallic smell of tools hanging on the walls. He pointed to a small room behind the kitchen. A bed was propped against the wall with a folded blanket and a slightly worn pillow on it. Here, he said, his voice as calm as if this were just another transaction. On the table, he placed a glass of clear water and a piece of pre-cut cornbread. Calla looked at them for a long time, then slowly sat down in a chair. She held the glass, drinking small sips as if afraid it would disappear if she drank too quickly. Levi turned away, not forcing her to eat, not asking any questions. They barely spoke all afternoon. Levi went out to tend to the goats, tack up some boards on the chicken coop. Calla stayed inside, watching through the window. Whenever he passed across the yard, she tilted her head to watch. But if he looked up, she looked down, pretending to be busy with her cornbread. At night, the wind brought the smell of dry grass and the dampness of the earth into the house. Levi placed the oil lamp on the kitchen table, the yellow light reflecting on the wall like a quiet flame. He knocked lightly on Calla's door, not entering. "I'm not taking that money back. And you? Don't owe me." From the darkness, Calla replied, her voice hoarse from the day's silence, "I know." The door closed. Levi went back to the porch and sat down on the old wooden chair. He looked up at the sky where the stars were slowly scattering like white salt. Somewhere in the distance, the howling of wolves echoed, but it carried no sense of danger, just the sound of a wasteland accustomed to solitude. Inside, Calla didn't lie down on the bed. She sat with her back against the wall, her knees pulled to her chest. Levi's jacket was still draped over her shoulders, and the scent of smoke and sweat was in her breath. For the first time in months, she was in a room with a door that locked from the inside, and it made her chest feel strangely tight. Not exactly safe, but a first step toward it. The following days passed in a quiet rhythm. Levi rose early, went to the fields, tended the barn. Calla swept the floors, wiped the tables, sometimes just stood for long periods on the porch, looking out at the cracked fields. They exchanged short sentences, usually about work or the weather. But between them, there were moments of unforced silence, the silence of two people who knew they were treading the fragile territory of trust. One morning, Levi left a clean folded towel on the steps. When Calla came out, she saw it, paused, and picked it up without saying anything. That afternoon, he found the towel washed, dried, and put it back where it belonged. No one said thank you. No one needed to. In that silence, Calla began to realize here no one would take back anything she touched. And that was the first freedom she regained, small but real as breathing. Mornings in Hollow Bend always began with the wind whistling through the porch. But for Calla, any sudden sound, a door slamming, the pounding of hooves, the clanking of bottles, made her heart jump. Once it was just Levi slamming the lid of a wooden chest on the porch, and she froze, eyes wide, breathing short and quick. Levi stood still for a moment, not moving closer, just nodding slightly, as if to say he understood, then continued his work, walking deliberately slower. Rumors of the girl Levi bought spread like wildfire. The town men laughed, the wives looked at her like a stain. One afternoon, Levi was leading his horse to the blacksmith shop, and Rufus, the talkative one in town, smirked. "I heard you brought a piece of junk home. Be careful of the risk, Harrow." Levi didn't change his tone or his eyes. "The only risk is if you stay here another minute." Rufus sneered but backed away. The news, like all the news in Hollow Bend, was told again at the bar that night, and so it went. On the farm, their lives were stitched together in small pieces. One morning, Calla came out with a small cloth bag containing a few handfuls of seeds of mint dill and an herb whose name she remembered only from her mother's kitchen. She knelt on the ground, digging small holes with her hands, placing the seeds carefully and covering them with soil. Levi watched from the fence, his hammer still in his hand. He didn't ask, didn't move. When she was done, he quietly added a small fence around the bed of soil to keep the chickens from scratching. The old wounds on Calla's hands were still purple and brown, and in some places the rope had dug deep enough to leave faint furrows. The next morning, Levi left a clean towel on the steps as before. This time, Calla replaced it with a sprig of fresh mint, still damp with dew. Fixing the fence became a shared chore. Levi held the post, Calla held the nails, the hammer pounding steadily on the wood. At first, each time the hammer struck hard, she would clench her shoulders and close her eyes, but after a few days, the jerks became less frequent. He noticed it but said nothing. One cold morning, Levi made more coffee. He poured it into a tin cup and set it in front of Calla. She looked at the cup, then at him, hesitating before reaching out to take it. The steam rose, the warm bitterness spreading to her chest. She took a sip, letting the cup sit in her hand longer than necessary. Levi just bent down to slice the cornbread, not breaking the silence. Some days Calla would disappear from sight for hours. Levi would find her behind the hill where there was a flat, empty area facing west. She sat there, knees to her chest hair, in the wind eyes staring into the distance. The first time he saw her, he started to walk over, then stopped. There were places in a person's mind that should not be entered unless invited. Gradually, the distance between them became less sharp. One afternoon, as Levi carried a sack of goat feed across the porch, his shoulder brushed hers. She did not move away. It was only a light touch, but it stood there silent, like a milestone of a path being opened. And then one evening, as the wind from the valley swayed the lamp, Calla placed another cup before Levi. This time she poured him coffee. He looked at her, not thanking her, but his eyes slowly lowered to the cup, then lifted it to drink. In the small kitchen, the smell of coffee, the smell of mint from the garden beds, and the smell of old wood mingled as if the air had a way of keeping them both there. Freedom doesn't always come with a gunshot. It comes like this, with a hot cup of coffee, a sprig of mint, and a touch on the shoulder that doesn't make anyone back down. That afternoon, the wind blew from the east, carrying the smell of dust and old wine. Levi recognized him before he saw him. On the edge of the hill, right where the broken fence had not yet been replaced, Otis Granger sat on horseback, a glass bottle glinting in his hand. He did not enter or leave, just stood there like a stain that refused to be washed away. The setting sun gilded his figure, casting a shadow that stretched all the way to Levi's property. The next day the same, and the next. Not a word, not a step closer, but Otis's presence cut a new hole in the fragile silence of the farm. Then on Wednesday night, as Levi was washing his hands in the wooden sink, a loud thud sounded from the front door. He opened it and found a stone wrapped in a piece of paper tied with a thin rope on the porch step. The paper was unrolled, and the words were scrawled across it. "Nothing of mine is lost forever." Underneath was a dark stain. Whether it was wine or blood, it was unclear. Calla stood behind him, her eyes fixed on the words. Her hands clenched, her knuckles white. After a long moment, her voice rang out low and hoarse. "He won't let this go." Levi folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Neither do I." The next morning, as the sun crept over the hill, Levi took his hammer to the broken fence. Calla followed, carrying nothing but her hands. He set down the bag of nails without speaking, but when she bent to hold him up, her hands gripped the wood in affirmation. The hammering beat was steady, interspersed with the cracking of wood. She stopped being startled and even started handing him the nails before he could reach them. They worked all day, sweat forming dust on their foreheads. When the last post was driven in, they both sat down on the ground, shoulder to shoulder. "I'm tired of always being someone else's to do whatever they want," Calla said, looking out at the fields in the distance. "I want to do something with someone, even if it's just fixing a fence." Levi turned his face towards her, the sunlight drawing sharp lines on her cheekbones. "Then let's start here." From that day on, fieldwork was no longer Levi's work or Calla's work. Together, they weeded the mint beds together, they watered the goat troughs together, they hauled sacks of feed from the barn. At night, when the sky was a deep purple, they sat on the porch, not waiting for Otis to appear, but to guard the land they were rebuilding bit by bit. Otis was still out there, likely to return at any moment. But Calla was beginning to understand that freedom was not just about running away, but also about standing still, shoulder to shoulder, and knowing that this time she was not alone. And that's something even Otis can't touch. The moon hung low that night, so full and white that the courtyard seemed torn apart by its cold light. There was no wind, only the slow creaking of the old windmill, like the heartbeat of an animal waiting for prey. Levi sat on the porch gun across his lap, looking out at the eastern fence. He had felt it all afternoon, a silence that came not from peace, but from someone holding their breath before striking. Then a rustling sound came from the edge of the woods. The yellow light of a match flashed, illuminating Otis Granger's face, red with drink, tangled with revenge. In his right hand he held a pistol. In his left he swung a bottle of whiskey, drops of which fell to the ground like old blood. "I've come to take back what's mine," Otis roared, his voice breaking in the void. "You think a few coins will sever the bloodline?" Levi stood slowly, gun still lowered but finger on the trigger. She belonged to no one but herself. Otis chuckled, took another step, and his shadow swallowed him into the yard. "You want to die for that illusion?" The door opened before Levi could reply. Calla stepped out barefoot on the wooden floor. her hair falling in a shadow. Levi's jacket was draped over her shoulders, but her face was clear in the moonlight, unshaken. "You never get to raise your hand to me again," she said, each word as clear as a knife, cutting into the night. Otis paused, his finger on the trigger, twitching slightly. "You think you're stronger than me just because you're behind him?" "No." Calla took a step forward. "Because I survived you trying to kill me over and over again. And now I don't bow my head anymore." Levi saw Otis's wrist tense. In that instant, he pulled the trigger. The sound of a gunshot split the ground. Otis screamed. The gun fell from his hand, blood pouring from his left wrist into the dust. Levi lowered the gun but did not step forward. "I will not kill you because she does not need blood to be free. But if you turn back, I will not shoot as a warning." Otis staggered, clutching his wound, his eyes bloodshot with pain and humiliation. He looked at Calla, but his gaze no longer grasped anything. There was only an empty void where power had been. "Go," Levi said, his voice as decisive as a slammed door. Otis turned and stumbled into the darkness, leaving a trail of blood on the ground. The bottle fell and shattered, the smell of alcohol mixing with the dust and the night. Calla stood still, watching her father disappear over the horizon. Then she took a deep breath, as if to fill the void he had left. Levi turned about to say something, but she spoke first, softly. "Thank you." He shook his head. "You did it yourself. I just kept him from stopping you." Calla looked down at her hands, saw they were no longer shaking. She clenched them, then unclenched them, testing her grasp on something new: control. The moon was still bright above, but it no longer shone down on the scene. It shone on a courtyard where the darkness had been pushed back, at least for tonight. And in the chill of the night, Calla knew this was the true moment of freedom, a freedom she had not asked for, had not been given, but had stood tall to reclaim. Night had receded behind the hills, leaving the courtyard so quiet that you could hear the wind blowing through the planks. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air, mixed with the alcohol from the broken whiskey bottle. Levi and Calla sat on the porch steps, neither speaking, just letting their shoulders lightly touch, as if they were testing the feeling of being close to each other without the shadow of the past intruding. Outside the fence, the ground was still streaked with Otis's blood, but at this distance, they were just dark streaks fading in the moonlight. Calla looked down at her bare feet, a thin layer of dust clinging to them like ash, and realized for the first time that they weren't trembling. Levi looked over slowly, as if afraid to break the moment of peace. His voice was low, but firm. "You ain't what happened to you." Calla turned, her gray eyes meeting his dark brown. No empty words of comfort, no promises of protection. Just a truth stated neatly to stand there like a new landmark. She didn't answer right away. Instead, Calla took a deep breath, as if to fill her lungs with new air, one that no longer smelled of alcohol or the sound of whiplash. In that moment, she felt larger, as if she had reclaimed a room within herself that had been locked away. "So what are you?" she asked, her voice soft but not trembling. Levi smiled a smile that wasn't exactly happy, but genuine. "I'm not what happened to me either." They sat there for a long time, looking at the horizon where the first streaks of dawn were splitting the night into thin strands. The rooster in the coop began to crow. The goats bleated from the barn. Everything was so normal that it was hard to believe that only a few hours ago a gun had gone off in this very yard. As the light faded, Calla stood up and walked down the steps. Her feet hit the cold ground, but instead of flinching, she let the feeling spread, a reminder that she was still standing here on the land she had chosen to stay. Levi followed, saying nothing, just passing by to open the gate for her. They started the morning as usual. Levi checked the fence, Calla drew water for the goats, then watered the mint patch, which grew greener every day. She bent down, smelled the leaves, and smiled when she saw how deeply rooted the plants were. Her freedom was the same, still fragile, but rooted in the soil. That morning, they ate breakfast at the same table. Levi placed a slice of cornbread and a cup of coffee in front of her window. She responded by pouring him another cup without saying thank you, because here small actions spoke volumes. After eating, Calla took the bucket to the well. Levi wanted to tell him to do it, but he stopped. She needed to pull each bucket up herself, hear the chain squeak through the pulley, feel the weight. When she set the bucket down on the steps, Calla straightened her back and let out a long breath, as if she had just completed a task meant for her. That afternoon, they patched the chicken coop roof together. Calla held the boards, Levi hammered in the nails. The sunlight swept through her hair, picking up wisps of golden dust that floated in the air. Each hammer blow was a new heartbeat, one that had been muffled for years. When they were done, they returned to the porch. This time they sat closer together, Levi's arm resting comfortably on his knee, his cup of water in his other hand. Calla pulled up her pillow, leaning lightly against the wooden beam. "Do you think he will come back?" she asked. Levi looked out into the distance where the dark hills ran like still waves. Maybe. But next time he wouldn't find the girl he knew. Calla smiled, a real smile, not forced. "I hope so." The sky darkened again, but this time the darkness was different. It was not pressing, not heavy, just covering the farm like a great blanket. Levi sat there listening to the windmills creaking, the goats clucking in the pen. Calla sat beside him, her hair swaying in the wind. In the silence, she placed her hand on her knee, not searching, not testing, just there. Levi looked down, then placed his hand on top, gently but firmly. No one said anything. No need. Because that very night under the stars and the sound of the western wind, they both knew they were no longer what had happened to them. And freedom, something truly their own, had begun to take root deep and strong, like the mint in the yard. Spring came slowly in Hollow Bend, but it did come. The thin ice on the gutters melted, revealing clear flowing water. The ground, parched and cracked by months, began to soften beneath their boots. Calla and Levi had found a rhythm to their lives, unhurried, uncommitted, but knowing that when they opened their eyes the next morning, the other would still be there. Calla never said when she decided to stay. Maybe it wasn't a single day, but several mornings when she opened the door and saw the morning sun shining on the newly built fence, when she washed her hands with the mint soap she'd made herself, when Levi placed a hot cup of coffee in front of her without any conditions. Freedom, she realized, didn't come in a single moment. It grew like the mint in the yard, slowly but surely. The farm began to bear her mark. The windows were washed, letting golden light into the kitchen. The herb beds on the porch were greener, interspersed with a few wildflowers Calla had found in the fields. She had sewn the old curtains herself, adding a few red stitches, not for beauty, but to make them different, to make them belong here and to her. Levi had built a new section of fence, not just to keep the goats in, but to serve as a clear boundary for what he wanted to protect. Occasionally they heard from the town about Otis. He wasn't back, not yet. The rumors faded, replaced by more casual conversations. Rufus would occasionally throw back a sneer, but Levi would just turn away and Calla would stop bowing. In the evenings when the work was done, they sat on the porch, Levi whittling wood into little birds and Calla sewing. Sometimes she read to him lines from an old book she found at the market. Her voice was slow, hesitant, but warm. He did not speak, just letting her voice blend with the wind. One afternoon in the early summer, Levi brought home from town a piece of cloth. He laid it on the table and unfolded it, a simple blue dress, cool in fabric, reaching to the ankles. "It suits you," he said, as if he were merely commenting on the color of the sky. Calla stroked the hem of her dress, the smoothness of it, a far cry from the worn fabric she had worn. She wore it the next day, not for Levi, not for compliments, but because she wanted to see herself differently, to look in the mirror and see someone no longer bound to dust or whips. The sky was clear that day, the wind carrying the scent of new grass. Calla stepped out onto the porch in a green dress, her hair tied back, her feet bare on the wooden floor. Levi stood at the fence, turning when he heard her. He said nothing, just looked, then held out his hand. She stepped forward, placing her hand in his. Levi's hand was calloused, warm, and squeezed just enough to let her know she wasn't alone. They stood there looking out at the open fields where the sun was sinking, dyeing the sky a coppery red. Neither of them broke the silence because they both knew that this was the answer to everything they had experienced. Not promises, not far-off plans, but the present moment, peaceful, steady, and completely willing. Home, Calla thought, was more than four walls, a roof, or a fence. Home was the steady hand that held you when no one else would. A place where you could stand tall, take a deep breath, and know you didn't have to ask permission to be here. The blue dress fluttered in the wind. Levi squeezed her hand a little more, not to hold her back, but to say that if she wanted to leave one day, his hand would open. But today, they both chose to stay, and that was what mattered. If you feel this story touches you and want to continue accompanying the journeys in the Wild West, where people find themselves in the vastness of the world, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.